The Prairie Patchwork mix. What's in it? What is it used for? Where should you use it? And what are the benefits of that mix for you? The Prairie Patchwork mix is a mix of wildflowers for a wildflower meadow. So we're thinking of aesthetics. We're thinking of a landscaping kind of purpose, but not a formal landscape where we've got the plants with mulch in between. It's hard to do that from seeds, not that you couldn't try. So we're thinking of a wildflower meadow where we've just got this different array of plants that are blooming through the different seasons. Landscaping is the primary purpose of this mix, but what are the other things that we're thinking about when we're designing a Prairie Patchwork mix that you would know that this is the mix that you want for your site? When we're thinking about designing something for aesthetics, they say beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and so what you think is beautiful might be different than what I think is beautiful. But for the most part, most people agree that for aesthetics purposes, a wildflower meadow, we don't want things too tall. Now, in a rainfall zone where we get 30, 40, 50 inches of rain a year, the plants just naturally get tall, and the better the soil, the taller they tend to get. But we can choose species that tend to grow shorter. When I say short, I'm thinking about waist high. So we try to aim for the Prairie Patchwork mix to more or less be waist high plants. In other words, we're aiming for them to not be 10 or 12 foot tall plants because most people don't want that in their wildflower meadow. If you do want that in a wildflower meadow, you can always add some of those species to, say, a Prairie Patchwork mix. But we've designed this to not be too tall. We've designed it to bloom spring through fall. So no plant has a bloom cycle of all the way from the spring through all the way through the fall. So different things are blooming as we go through the seasons. That's always changing in color and texture and of course, the different wildflower name that goes with each of those. So we've designed it to think about that spring through fall bloom so that we're not just spring bloomers or not just fall blooming plants. Another thing that we think about with a Prairie Patchwork mix is we want this mix to be adapted to a mesic soil. And by mesic, I mean not too wet and not too dry. If you grow a vegetable garden, you know what good soil is because you don't want your vegetable garden soil to be too dry or too wet either. The soils are good enough for that. It's not super dry, not super wet. So our theory of design for this mix, we talked about we want it to be pretty, so aesthetically pleasing. So we don't want it to be too tall. We want it to bloom spring through fall. We want it to be adapted, the plants that we put in it, to this mesic site, not too wet, not too dry. Another criteria is most of the plants are perennials, so they're going to come back from the root system year after year. While it's a little slow to establish on the front end, and we do put some annuals and biennials in there to kind of give you color during that time, the good thing is that once you have it established and those perennial plants are blooming, as long as they're adapted to the site, as long as you've chosen your mix well that's adapted to the site, and the management is good, we should continue to see those plants coming back from that root system year after year and continuing to provide pretty blooms in that situation. Now, the Prairie Patchwork mix is a mix of wildflowers, so there's really no grasses in it. However, I do recommend mixing it with a grass mix, and we'll chat a little bit more about that here in a moment. But common species included in the Prairie Patchwork mix, and it is subject to change, as there's not a good harvest of something, that species might go out until we have a good harvest of it in a later year or something along, we're always balancing the inventory that is available to keep the mix economical as well. But common species that might be in that mix in any given year would be things that bloom in spring, summer, and fall. So let's look a little bit at some of the spring wildflowers that are often in the mix. Yellow wingstem, pale purple coneflower, wild bergamot, some of the coreopsises, such as grand coreopsis. And then we move into some of the summer blooming wildflowers. Things like white beard tongue, common black-eyed Susan, the plains coreopsis, some of the mountain mints. And then, of course, we want to end up the season, the bloom season, with wildflowers that are going to bloom there in the fall, such as some of the asters that like a mesic site. Also, maybe some of the goldenrods that like that mesic site. And the goldenrods that will be in this mix are not the weedy, aggressive ones, such as Canada or tall goldenrod, that often show up, in fence lines, in fields, in certain areas that are more aggressive. And it all depends on what your area is as to, whether or not that particular species is aggressive. But these are some of the goldenrods that are going to be colorful, actually attract the monarch butterflies as they migrate back through, and just be a good all-around, not too aggressive, not take over the planting kind of species addition to it. Now, I mentioned that there are no grasses in this particular mix, and the reason for that is we want you to be able to blend the grasses and the wildflowers at the ratio that suits you best. And so if you want lots of wildflowers, then go like 75% wildflowers and 25% grasses. So why would you go ahead and include the grasses in there in the first place if what you really want is the wildflowers? Well, I'm going to give you a couple reasons. I think they're a really important part of the ecosystem and the habitat, but there's a lot of reasons that may, have a real impact on you that mean that you want to put them in there. So one of those reasons is they fill the voids between the wildflowers. Wildflowers tend to be very tall and upright. They don't tend to have a lot of, basal fountainy leaves. They don't cover the soil well by themselves. They tend to be a stem sticking out of the ground. Now that's a generalization, but when you just have stems sticking out of the ground, you don't have good soil cover. So not only is that important for things like soil health, but from the aesthetic standpoint, usually we don't want to see weeds out there like ragweed, foxtail, crabgrass, these sort of plants. And what those plants are is they're annuals, and they're just responding to open space. So if there's open space between the plants, the sunlight is hitting the soil, triggering those seeds to germinate, then you get a profusion of these weeds, and that's not what we usually consider pretty. Now, I should point out, during the establishment years, the perennial plants are developing their root systems, and patience is really required. So you should expect those during the establishment years. But what we want is when we get to that mature planting, if we can minimize, and there's always going to be some, but we really want to minimize those plants because most people don't think of that as beautiful. And so those grasses are going to help cover that soil, discourage the weeds that come up between the wildflowers. Another good reason to include the grasses is the aesthetic quality in the fall and winter. So they have a neat texture, they have neat colors, they can be kind of almost a bright orange on a really cloudy day, or kind of a rainy day. They can have rusty red colors. Now, I mean, it's not like a wildflower kind of, aesthetic beauty. It's not that bright, striking color, but it can really give some relief to the winter. It's kind of like the fall leaf colors, and it's not, again, quite that bright, but it just adds interest to an otherwise pretty plain brown landscape. So that winter and fall interest of the grasses is also there. The grasses have an impact if you want to do a controlled burn, and controlled burns are not essential, but once the planting is established, so winter 2, 3, 4, if you want to do a controlled burn, the grasses are going to help provide the fuel for that burn. If you don't want to do a controlled burn, that's just fine. The grasses will give you that if you want it, and they will also kind of help. Sometimes the wildflowers can get a little bit gangly. They can help support those in certain situations. Now, what we don't want is we don't want our wildflowers or our grasses to be detracting from the wildflowers. So we want to choose some that are fairly short to go with our wildflowers. So if we choose grasses that are going to not, get super big and tall, so we don't want the big blue stems and the Indian grasses that are going to be super tall. We want the things that are going to peak out at waist high, give or take. And so choosing those grasses is really important part of not detracting from the wildflowers. I would consider the companion grass mix for mesic sites to be a good companion to that prairie patchwork mix. Again, it likes the same sort of soils. The grasses are fairly unaggressive grasses that kind of just cover between, they share well with the wildflowers, if you will. So how much should we include of each one? Well, we leave that for you to decide because your situation is different than the next person's situation. But here's some factors to help you think about it. If you want lots of wildflowers, if that's what's pretty to you, choose like 75% wildflower mix, so the prairie patchwork, and 25% of the companion grass mix. This will make a nice, good, colorful showing, but it still has the benefits of those grass plants out there while not having too many. If you're like, hey, maybe a more balanced mix, let's go 50-50. There's nothing wrong with that. So in what you're saying when you're doing that is assuming that things establish like they normally do, 50% of the plants of the soil area would be covered with wildflowers and 50% would be covered with the grasses. And so, but maybe there's other factors in your mind and maybe you would like more grasses. So factors that would push you more in this direction would be, well, if you like the look of the grasses and you're like, I want a grass field with a few wildflowers scattered through it. Okay, let's go, you know, only 25% or 10% of the Prairie Patchwork mix and do the remainder in the companion grass mix for mesic sites. Or maybe economics, your budget is playing into this. The grasses are less expensive than the wildflowers, so move yourself down to more grasses and less wildflowers if that might be the case. So you can choose which of these to do and which of the options, how much of each mix to do to best suit your goals and your site. Are there other benefits to the Prairie Patchwork mix? And of course, I'm considering it in with at least some amount of companion grass mix for mesic sites. What are the other benefits to it? There's a huge soil health benefit. A lot of us don't really understand, like, why am I even concerned about soil health? But there's various reasons that people are concerned about soil health. And I'll just give a couple here to help you understand why that might be important to you. The productivity of a soil is tied to its soil health. So that might be one reason that you want, you know, a productive soil. You want a healthy soil. That just, the concept of, you know, we don't want unhealthy people, we don't want unhealthy animals, we don't want unhealthy soils. So there's something to being said for just that concept of being healthy. But then on the other side, there's also if climate change is a concern of yours. So you've got the carbon dioxide in the air. This diversity of plants can take up more carbon dioxide, can build a healthier soil, and basically that healthy soil is storing organic matter, which is to say carbon. So it's carbon that's being captured from the air and put into that soil. So maybe that's a concern of yours. But then maybe something that's a little easier for us to all see is the wildlife benefits, the pollinator benefits. So these plants are going to provide, you know, food to the insects, which are the base of the food chain. Quail, songbirds, a lot of these critters eat insects during the summertime when they're available. And so you've got the base of that food chain in this diversity of plants. Also, from the pollinator standpoint, we've got the pollen and nectar coming off through the different seasons so that, you know, our pollinators are not just like feast and famine where they only have food during part of the year. Another reason that this is beneficial to wildlife would be the seed production. Some of these plants are going to have quite nutritious seed for wildlife, say during the winter. Or some animals like to eat the green foliage of these plants. So it just depends on the kind of wildlife or pollinator that you're talking about as to how this mix might benefit them. But there's a lot of benefit from a diversity of native plants for our native wildlife and pollinators. Animals aren't the only one that can benefit from the plants in these mixes. If you're into medicinal and edible plants, some of these plants are going to have those properties and you can start to experiment with using some of those plants. Another benefit might be if you would like to make some bouquets, whether that is dried bouquets or whether that's a fresh flower arrangement. You can pick, you know, during the season of its bloom, you can pick some of those plants to do that with and enjoy them in that way. If you're ready to plant but you don't quite know how, there are guides and videos on our website where you can learn more about getting good seed to soil contact, how to scatter the seed. It's not really daunting once you know the process and understand it. It's just a matter of having a plan. So check those resources out to help yourself along the way. Here at Hamilton Native Outpost, we really love to share native plants with people, and it's one of our passions to design mixes that will suit the needs of the people that are using them. We want that mix to be what is going to provide a lot of enjoyment and, you know, just be a good match for people. So that's one of the things we really love to do here at Hamilton Native Outpost.